opportunity to thank Antoine for the opportunity to present, and a warm welcome to everybody who has logged on to the presentation tonight. So in this presentation, I want to share with you the demands of hurling and how we are working with the players to prepare them for these demands. So the first thing I want you to do tonight, I want to cover three main things. I want to look at the structure of the game and what we know about the game, what we know about the movement demands, and then we'll briefly describe some skill demands. So thinking about the game, it has been shown in other team sports that the overall match duration is a poor indicator of what actually happens in the game. So we set about investigating the match play activity cycles within hurling. And what I want to present to you is a concept of the overall game duration, then the duration and the number of ball in play and ball out of play cycles, the individual duration and the number of ball in play and ball out of play cycles. We look at the frequency of those, and we talk maybe briefly about the stoppages and how the game stops and the impact that has on how we condition our players. So according to the playing rules, senior hurling games last for 70 minutes. Now, and for club, it lasts 60 minutes. However, when time is added on for substitutions and injuries, we now know that the game on average lasts for 76 minutes. So we are actually preparing players for a longer game than the rules. Now, that doesn't surprise us because all of us as coaches understand that there's additional time at the end of a half and at the end of a game. But to further analyze this block of 76 minutes, we needed to understand how the game starts and stops. So we have the concept of starting and stopping and starting and stopping and starting and stopping, right? And how much time is allowed for the ball in play and ball out of play. So we said, right, the ball is in play for on average 30 minutes and out of play for 45 minutes. Now, what do we call in play? Well, for example, the game starts by the referee throwing in the ball and there's play until it goes out over the sideline or goes over the bar or whatever for a free. And then the clock stops until the game is restarted. So the overall block of 76 minutes is divided into a 30-minute in play and 45-minute out of play. Now, that still doesn't really tell us much about what actually happens in the structure of the game. So if I draw your attention to the top of the screen, and the blue bars represent the time the ball is in play, and the yellow bars, the ball out of play. Now, this is data taken from the first 8 minutes of a championship game, and it's quite common right across all our games, be it at underage, at senior, at intercounty, and at club. So, for example, the referee starts the game by throwing in the ball, and there's play for maybe 11 seconds. Then it's out of play, then it's in play, then it's out of play, in play, out of play, in play, out of play. So there's a constant seesaw effect right across the game, right up to half time, and then a break for half time, and the same happens in the second half. Okay, the duration of these vary throughout, right? And what we want to find out is, well, because the game starts and stops, is there some pattern, or can they be grouped together to identify, well, are they more short duration, medium duration, or longer duration? So what we did was we grouped them, okay? So what we see at the bottom of the screen, we see that, again, in the blue bars represent the ball in play and the yellow out of play. And what we find is 80% of all stoppages and all ball in play happen under 30 seconds. So the game is constantly starting and stopping, starting and stopping. Now, as we go along the graph to the right of the screen, there is a a dramatic in the number of time the ball is in play and out of play. But they do occur, so we also have to have the player ready for them. Because the stopping and starting very, very frequently, under 30 seconds, well, if we have activities within training that last for long periods of time, well, what ends up happening is the players get used to performing at a slow pace. If we think about some activities that are continuous in nature, right? Well, we're maybe not preparing them for this fast changes in speed, okay? And switching between ball in play and ball out of play. Okay, so then we looked at the number and what stops the game, all right? So we have 5 stoppages types. So top left-hand corner shows a throw-in, okay? Bottom left, the sideline, the ball goes out over the sideline. Top right, a free that is going to be scored, and then free or maybe wide. So we classify that as free attempted. And then the bottom right is a free that stays in play. And then in the middle, a score or a wide. So they are the possibilities of how the game might stop. But a question for you now to think about is, which one of these happen the most and which one of them give us the longest stoppage type? Okay, so here's what we found. The blue bars represent the number of stoppages. Okay, so the number of stoppages. And we see that on 46 occasions, on average, in a inter-county game, the game stops by a shot at goal that goes over the bar, into the net, or wide. The second frequent stoppage is a free that is attempted. So that free that might be scored or hit wide. And then the others make up the remaining game stoppages. However, we need to think about this is how the game stops, right? So from a coach's point of view, the implication for us is to think about how the game restarts, right? So if the game is stopping and starting on average 46 times with a shot at goal, well, there's going to be on average 46 puckouts. And this is the emphasis lately on practicing puckouts. Now, if we're thinking about the amount of shots at goal, well, it makes sense that we would practice puckouts because it happens. And we know before we go out that it's going to happen very frequently over the match. So if we look at the time that's associated with each one of these, and we see that the free attempted takes on average a minute. So for example, the referee gives a free in. By the time the ball is back in play, it takes around 60 seconds. Now, how might that be the case? Well, the referee gives a free and the clock stops, right? So the ball in play is started. The free taker maybe jog over to the free, place the ball, and then takes a shot at goal and the ball goes over the bar or wide. By the time the goalkeeper then gets the ball back into play, there's 60 seconds on average gone. If we look back to the shots at goal, which results in the puck out, restarting it, well, we see that on average, it takes 21 seconds to get back in play. Now, this has implications for our attacking team and defending team. So if the ball goes wide from a shot at goal or over the bar, our players need to be ready for the resultant puck out very, very quickly. So not only are we practicing puck outs, we need to be practicing getting set up quickly. Now, what you noticed even in this year's championship, the number of points and the number of shots a goal actually increased. And the time that the ball was back in play was even shorter than the 21 seconds. And some of the reason might be the lack of spectators in at the games, because usually the goalkeeper might be slowing down the play to get the crowd quietened and get the players back or the ball back into play. Okay, so what do we know so far? Well, talking about the game structure, the ball is in play and it's out of play, right? The most ball in play and ball out of play lasts for under 30 seconds. And the most frequent stoppage is a shot at goal. And therefore, the most time that the ball or the game is restarted is from a puck out. The longest time is from frees scored or frees attempted. So let's now move on to the movement demands that we found out. So the first set of results come from a study that investigated the match play demands and positional demands at senior intercounty level. We looked at the total distance, the relative distance, which is the distance covered every minute, the distance at each speed, the peak speed, so what was the fastest speed that they hit, the number of sprints, and the average length of sprint. Now, on screen here, for those who may not have seen it before, is an example of a GPS plot. And you have the speed of travel on the left-hand side, which is the y-axis, and the x-axis is the time along the bottom. And as the game is going on, the player now is moving up and down the speeds. So what we wanted to find out is the different speeds of movement. So we introduced 5 different speeds of movement. The lower speed, which was up to 1.2 meters per second, we counted as walking, then jogging, then running, then high speed running, and sprinting. So based on previous research in Gaelic football, we were tied into using speed thresholds that were in the literature. And we counted high speed running at between 4.8 to 6.1 meters per second, or 17 kilometers an hour, or sprinting then over 6.1 meters per second, or over 22 kilometers an hour. So the results, well, from what we found is that in the 70-minute game, or even 76-minute game, the hurlers on average covered 7,800 meters. Now, this is slightly lower than Gaelic football, which have been shown to cover 8,600 meters. Now, on average, this works out at 109 meters covered every minute for the duration of the game. Okay, but as we now know, that total distance gathers all of that distance together, be it walking, jogging, running, sprinting, and high-speed running, which gives us an overall value for the match, but it doesn't really tell us what actually happened. So what we want to do is to break down into the speeds. So what we found is that the total distance is spread across all the 5 different speeds, and the majority of it, over 3,000 of the total distance, was covered walking. All right, and as we move across to the right, the speed of the movement increases, but the distance covered decreases. So if I draw your attention to the bottom of the screen, we see that the red box highlights all the period of time that the player was walking. So it's not that the player is walking for any length of time or any particular length of distance. They're constantly changing speed. Okay? So if we just focus on the top end of the graph on the right-hand side and we look at the demands of sprinting, well, we found that on average that they cover 415 meters sprinting, right? And that was divided into 22 different sprints. The average length of sprint was 19 meters, and the peak speed that players hit was 8.4 meters per second. Now, that is lower than their actual speed. Some players can hit 10 and maybe 11 meters per second, so that they're not even hitting their max speed. But again, this was an average, so some players may have hit higher speeds. In order to look at the positions, we needed to classify them into different positions. The full back line being the cornerback, fullback, and the other cornerback. Then the half back line, midfielders, half forward, and full forward into positional lines. So then we were able to compare the different positions. So here's what we found. If we take a moment just to have a look at what we found. So the first column represents total distance. And we see that broken into fullbacks, halfbacks, midfield, half forwards, and full forwards. And what we notice that the middle three positions, halfbacks, midfield, and half forwards, outperform the full back line and full forward line. Now that makes sense, really, when you think about it, that they're out in the middle of the field and they're involved in more action. We move to the center column for high-speed running, and a similar pattern exists that, again, the middle three positions cover more high-speed running than the full back line and full forward line. And the final column on the right-hand side shows that the sprint distance. Now, a very interesting thing happened here is that there was no difference, no significant difference between any of the positions. So no matter where you are in the field, full back line, half back line, midfield, half forward, and full forward, you need to be able to perform similar distances at sprinting capacity. So the next thing we wanted to find out was, does the game change as it progresses? And what we looked at was the differences between the first half and the second half. And what we found was that there was a 91 meter drop in total distance between the first half and second half. High-speed running reduced by 47 meters, and sprint distance reduced by 16 meters. Now, in practical terms, that is very, very small. So the coaching implication for us is that players need to be able to repeat the performance from the first half to the second half. Now, we wanted further to describe what actually happens per quarter. And what we found is, if we look at the left-hand side of the graph first, we look at high-speed running and the difference between quarter 1, 2, 3, and 4. In quarter 1, the players cover on average 250 meters of high-speed running, and then it decreases in quarter 2. Now, every quarter after the first quarter is different. So quarter 2, quarter 3, and quarter 4 is different from quarter 1. So players make a big bust in the first quarter and then reduce their high-speed running from the quarter afterwards. Now, interestingly, once that dip occurs in the second quarter, there's no difference right across from then on. So halftime seems to be come at a right time for them to recover and be able to perform in the second half. If we move to the right-hand side of the screen and we look at the sprint distance per quarter, even though that the line may go up and down significantly, there is no difference in between any quarter. So no matter what we have to do in terms of sprinting, they need to be able to do it for all the game. Okay, so if we think back to how the game is structured, with the ball is in play, out of play, in play, out of play, in play, out of play. And what we wanted to find out is what kind of demands occur when the ball is in play, and then what type of demands occur when it's out of play. And what we found is that there's greater total distance, high speed running, sprint distance, and the number of sprints when the ball is in play. When the ball is out of play, the intensity drops. Now, that makes kind of sense if we think about our eyes looking at the match and we see, oh, there's high activity, and then the activity drops. Now, finally, we have some data to back that up. Okay, but remember, if you can remember back, how long was the ball in play and how long the ball was out of play? And if you can remember, it was in play for 30 minutes and out of play for 45 minutes. So these data on the screen does not reflect like with like. Okay, so what we wanted to do was to look at it, what do they do every single minute? So when the ball is in play, the players cover on average 135 meters per minute versus 76 meters per minute when the ball is out of play. So there's high activity for that period in the blue bars on the top of the screen. And then when the ball is out of play, the intensity drops. High speed running shows very, very similar. So on average, it's 24 meters per minute, and then it reduces to 2 meters per minute. And then the sprint distance increases to 11 meters per minute when the ball is in play, and then decreases to 1 meter per minute on average when the ball is out of play. So what we want to do is to have players being able to repeat high intensity for when the ball is out of play. When the ball is in play. When the ball is out of play, it's not a negative thing. It facilitates them performing high intensity for the next ball in play. Now, if we're having continuous games for long durations, the players don't get the opportunity to change intensity, be it up intensity, down intensity, and then being able to repeat that. Okay, so what do we know now after a second? So the movement demands on average 7,800 meters, and the relative distance every single minute they cover 109 meters. Peak speeds 8.4 meters per second, on average over 400 meters sprinted across 22 sprints. High speed running decreases after the first quarter, but there's no difference in the sprint demands. And there's no difference in the sprint demands between positions. So what we wanted now to find out is looking at the higher intensity activity. So we looked at the sprint demands over the game. And what we wanted to find out was how many sprints occur under the 20 meters and over the 20 meters. We know that 8.4 meters per second was the highest sprint on average recorded, but how many occurred near that peak speed? Wanted to find out how much break they get between sprints, and then a repeated sprint bout. So a repeated sprint bout is a sprint occurs, and how many times does it occur within 1 minute? So what we found was, on average, 14 sprints occur under the 20 meters and 8 sprints over the 20 meters. There was on average 208 seconds between sprints, and on average 5 times over the game there was a back-to-back sprint. So there was 2 sprints within that 60 seconds. If we look at the bottom of the screen and we see the pink purple bars represent one player's sprints over a game. And what we see that at the start of the game, there was a big cluster of sprints. And then there was a long duration. And just before half time, there was another 3 sprints. The player was obviously off at half time. And then in the second half, they're more spread out. Now, the player doesn't really get to choose when they perform these sprints. So this is only an example of the profile of one player. But what we now know is that on average, they have 208 seconds in between. We know that players perform sprints at the start, up to halftime, after halftime, and right up to the end of the game. When we look at the sprints that occur up near their peak speed, we found that on average, above 80%, 11 sprints occur. Between 80 and 90, 8 sprints occur. And on 3 occasions, they got up to over 90% of their speed. Now, each player was recorded doing a 40-meter sprint in a test and classified into 80 to 90% of their speed. And we counted the number of times that they went into the threshold. We also looked at each of these factors, the number of sprints, the number of sprints under 20 and over 20, the peak speed, the intensity of sprints, the duration between sprints, and the repeated sprint bouts across all positions. And what we found out is that there was no difference across any position. So even though players are playing in the full back line, full forward line, or the middle three positions, there is no difference in the sprint demands right across any position. Now that is really, really important in terms of what we do in training, and all positions can do their sprint training together. So what we wanted to find out now was, what is the worst that can happen? And this concept of the maximum intensity period was investigated, right? So what was the worst 1 minute of total distance covered, of high speed running, of sprint distance? And we looked at across the game and cross positions. What's the worst that can happen in a game? If we think back to a couple of minutes ago, we found out that on average, players cover 109 meters every minute. And if we look at the top of the screen and we see that the black bars represent 109 meters every minute, and that's from minute 1 right up to minute 70 plus. But we found out that the ball is in play and out of play is lower and higher than that. So on average, it's 76 meters per minute when the ball is out of play, and then it's higher again, 134 meters per minute when the ball is in play. But that still doesn't tell us what was the worst that can happen. These are only average scores, right? So the worst that can happen is actually 184 meters per minute. So on one occasion in the game, players are required to cover 184 meters in a minute. Now, it only happens once, but it does happen. What we still don't know is, when does that maximum intensity period happen? And what we do know is that it doesn't happen for everyone at the same time. So some players might have their maximum intensity period in the first half or second half. If we move to the bottom of the screen, we see that the average high speed running and the average sprint distance are represented in the yellow and blue bars. And what we found is that the maximum intensity period, again, is much higher than the average scores. In fact, it's 42 meters of high speed of sprint distance and 54 meters of high speed running. So if we're only preparing the players around the average demands, well, we're under preparing them for the worst case scenario, or the maximum intensity period. We looked at the very same things for across positions. And for total distance and high speed running, we found that the middle three positions outperformed the full back line and full forward line. But again, if we look at the bottom of the screen, there was no difference in the worst case scenario or maximum intensity period when it comes to sprint distance. So again, if you have players in the middle three positions, they need to be doing more total distance and high speed running than the outside players. But when it comes to sprint distance, they all can do the same. So let's summarize what we know so far. Well, there's now a variety of sprint lengths, and players reach above 90% of their peak speed. They perform different intensities of sprints. The repeated sprints are rare, but they do happen. So that back-to-back sprint within that 60 seconds, it does happen. We need to consider the maximum intensity period along with the average data. And we also think about maximum intensity scenarios happen, but they only happen once in a game. So that, in terms of movement demands and game structure, informs us about the makeup of the game. But in terms of the skill demands, hurling is a really, really skillful game, and it must be considered in the overall picture of the demands of the game. Quite often, it's a case that we now are able to measure the movement demands, and now there's overemphasis on the physical demands, which is misdirecting so many coaches at the moment. So, Gearóid Hegarty was Hurler of the Year this year. And in the All-Ireland final, I wonder, can you think about how many possessions that he get? So, Gearóid got 20 possessions in this year's All-Ireland, broken into first and second half. But in terms of the other players on the team, how does he compare? Well, looking from the bottom of the screen upwards, we see that it goes from Nicky Quaid in goals right up to Graham Mulcahy at corner forward, and then the substitutions at the top of the screen. There was 185 possessions in total. So when all the green bars are added together, we know that there was 185 possessions. Now, what we notice is that some players have more than others. We see that Gearóid wasn't even the highest. We see that Kyle Hayes was the highest at 22 possessions. But something that you might be able to identify, is there actually a pattern of where the possessions are occurring and how many possessions they are? If you notice that the middle three positions have the most possessions on average, in the total number of possessions. Now, if you look at the games right across the season and compile all the teams together, you'll see something similar in terms of the distribution of the number of possessions per team, so that some players have more than others. Okay, but it gives us an overview of the number of possessions, but it doesn't really tell us anything about how they got the ball, what did they do when they had the ball, and how did they release the ball. So a project that we're working on at the moment is looking at the frequency of skills. So if you think for a moment of what are the top 5 most frequent skills performed in hurling. If you think for a moment, what are the top 5? So here's what we found. On average, players take steps, right? So the definition of steps is taking more than 2 steps in possession. Striking, catching, jab lift, and hand pass. So striking, an overall striking of 12, which breaks down into 6 short ones and 6 long ones. Catching, gaining possession, taking the ball off the ground, jab lift, and hand pass. So here are the 5 top skills performed in hurling. Now, if we break them down into gaining possession, maintaining possession, and releasing possession, we see that gaining possession, we have catching and jab lift. Maintaining possession, they take steps in possession. And then how do they get the release the ball? Well, they either strike it or hand pass it. Now, if we're thinking about our skill games and skill drills, well, we need to be thinking about incorporating these top 5 skills into those games and drills, because these are what the game will demand from the player. But not only that, is 185 possessions. Players have to make decisions. be it on the ball when they have possession, but only one person can have the ball at any particular time. So they need to think about possession when they're without possession. Okay. Think about time, but also pressure from opposition. This leads us to skill efficiency. So can the player deal with the number of possessions that they get? But can they deal with them efficiently? But also, what we now see is that can players be adaptable to different positions on the field because they pick up possession in different locations? If we think back to the All-Ireland final, we see that Kyle Hayes, right, was gaining possession in the defence, midfield, and attack. So he had 22 possessions, but he gained possession in a number of different locations. So if you think about your game and your setup of your activities to prepare these players, are they dealing with their possession and dealing without possession in different locations on the field? The big emphasis is their ability to scan. So for the majority of the game, they are without the ball. So can they be ready for the ball when it does arrive? So now we're coming to the end. We need to think about, well, we now know all this information about the game, but what are we going to do about it? So let's look at some practical applications of this data. So if we think back to the first thing we covered and we looked at how the game stops, well, we need to think about practicing shots at goal. So if we draw your attention to the game on A, top left-hand side of the screen, well, we might play a 4 versus 4, right? Yellow player maybe starts at the 65 with a 2-meter lead in the defender, and once he passes the 45, the match is on. Okay, so you're offering the opportunity to create a shot at goal. If we move underneath to B, well, by adding players into the dimensions, well, we're adding difficulty into getting that shot at goal. The top right-hand side of the corner of the screen, we now emphasize maybe the time element, and we give the attacking team X amount of time to score, and the defending team X amount of time to defend. Because what we now know is that the ball is going to be in play and out of play very, very quickly. So on average, it's going to be out of play within that 22 seconds. And then finally, the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, we see we could limit the space available to the players. So creating shots at goal is going to be far more difficult. Because shots at goal are most frequent stoppage, well, we need to practice the puck out and the restart. So maybe we think about setting up the players in their 15 positions and we practice puck outs. And we emphasize changing or adapting these conditions based on a number of elements at the bottom of the screen. So we have the space, the time, the task that we're asking the player to do, the equipment, and the players. So if we think about the space, well, we can limit the space so that it will increase the pressure on gaining possession. In terms of time, we can replicate the time associated with the restart, which is on average 20 seconds. Can the players get it back out into position? You may have a set routine, and that might be a task to carry out and practice that set routine. The equipment we see on the right-hand side of the screen may help us to differentiate a space that the players can move into or move out of, or the ball can move into that area. And finally, the players. Increasing the number of players for contesting for possession is going to increase the difficulty of gaining possession. Well, we now know that the stop-start activity occurs very, very frequently. Well, if we think about the top left-hand side of the screen, where we see a typical small-sided game, for example, it might be in a 40-meter by 40-meter area, and players keep possession of the ball. Now, this usually ends up with players performing similar low speeds, and players get used to living at a slow pace. And when they go into a game situation where the intensity changes very, very frequently, they struggle and they get tired. So if we adapt that game and we move to the bottom of the screen, by adding goals at each end, we focus the players into attacking and defending so that the players are moving up and down the area. But also by scoring, there is a break in play, be it short, but there is a break in play. Now, if we move to the top right-hand side of the screen, using goals may narrow the focus of attack. And what usually ends up happening after a period of time is that you have certain players standing around the goals. So if we look at C, well, we might have a game like a touchdown or American football style end zone game where the players have to work the ball into and out. And finally, D, we can insert a line halfway up that players must be inside that area in order to score. So that challenges the players to move up and down the pitch. Now, emphasizing high intensity, and we'll call that sprinting for a minute, we really need to think about how the area facilitates sprinting. So if we think about the top left-hand side of the screen, well, we play a lot of small-sided games, but can the players reach sprint speed? And quite often it's the case that the small area limits the number and the speed of which they can get up to that sprint speed. So you need to think about the area and the number of players within that small-sided game to facilitate sprinting. So if we adapt the game and we move to B by playing the same rules and shooting, well, the players have more space to run into and they're more likely to get up into that sprint speed. If we move over to C, we'll reduce the number of players playing the game, and then we might have two replacements on either side that they come in and out. So in terms of sprinting, they're recreating the opportunity to rest and then come in, work hard and get up sprints and then rest. So those players on the outside may rotate on a certain period of time. And finally, in D, quite often it's the case in a small-sided game that the ball does the movement instead of the players. So the players move the ball really, really quickly up and down the field, and then obviously that the players don't have to move. So you may have to restrict the length of striking or the numbers of striking occurrences in that small-sided game to facilitate more sprinting. So if we take the maximum intensity periods, where they cover more ground within that minute than any other, and I want to take you back into a traditional game that was played in hurling practices, and it was this concept of backs versus forwards. Now, quite often it's the case that we have backs versus forwards and we're running for a period of time and the intensity drops. Now, the intensity of movement drops because there is too much ball in play. The ball is constantly in play. So if you can remember a backs and forwards activity, well, we might have one or two or more feeders. We strike the ball in, the ball goes wide or goes over the bar, and then the next ball is in play very, very quickly. So there is a benefit to this, that we can keep the volume of work high, but the intensity ends up being low because there's too much ball in play. So even if we just adapt the idea of backs and forwards by just separating into two ends of the pitch, that we can have backs and forwards at each end, but they're offered opportunities for rest. So the ball might be struck into either end alternatively. So to summarize, I wanted to share three main themes tonight: the game structure, the movement demands, and the skill demands. So what we now know is that the ball is in play and out of play, that the most ball in play and ball out of play lasts for under 30 seconds, the most stoppages are shots at goal, and the time is the longest for frees attempted or free scored. In terms of movement demands, we know that the total distance is a poor indication of what actually happens in the game. On average, it's 109 meters a minute, but it reaches peaks of 135 when the ball is in play, and then the maximum intensity period is 184 meters per minute. Players reach, on average, peak speeds of 8.4 meters per second and slightly over 400 meters of sprint distance. They perform at least 22 sprints in a game, and that the performance drops after the first quarter, but then maintains it after that. There's no difference in the sprint demands or between positions or quarters. There's a variety of sprint lengths, and players reach above 80% of their peak speed. They perform different intensities of sprints, and the repeated sprints are rare, but they do happen. So we need to consider the maximum intensity periods along with the average data. They happen, but only once. And in terms of the skill demands, well, we now know that the most frequent skills in hurling are steps, striking, catching, jab lift, and hand pass. Skills vary between positions. The short time in possession. Players receive possession in a variety of different locations and from short and long ranges and different locations. So scanning is very, very important. We finally looked at practical applications in terms of stoppages and restarting and small sided games facilitating the movement demands and the skill demands of hurling. I'd like to thank you for your taking the time to attend tonight's webinar. Really, really appreciate it. I hope that you've taken something from this presentation, and thanks for listening.
Brilliant, Damien. Thanks very much for that. If you want to just stop sharing the screen there.
Yeah.
So, look, you said you'd give it maybe 5 minutes to answer some questions.
100%, yep.
Yeah, so if anybody's any questions they'd like to ask Damien, you can either use the chat box there and type your question in, or alternatively you can use the raise hand button and we can ask you then to unmute to avoid 70 different people speaking at once. So any questions, feel free to fire them in.
So Antoine, you can manage the questions there as they come in, and you can fire them across then.
I'll start off with one, Damien. Just you were speaking about the sprints, and you were speaking about those worst case scenarios, and then obviously the average sprint distance.
Yeah.
If, for example, you had a team, what distance of sprints are you talking? Are you talking a variety of different sprints? Bear in mind here, my club manager is in this, so I would appreciate to be kind before we turn back to the season in April. But what kind of sprints are you talking in regards to the distance? And then as well as that,
Yeah.
are you talking about sprints in game, like you just showed us? Or are you talking
Yeah.
about sprint in isolation as well?
Okay, so a couple of things now that we need to address. So on average, the length of the sprint is 19 meters. Okay. Now the problem is that is not from a standing start. Right? So players are going 6.1 meters per second first, and then it's 19 meters. So what ends up happening is, which is really, really important for hurling, and we haven't covered it tonight. It's another presentation. It's the acceleration. Okay, so we need to have an acceleration up to sprint speed. Okay, now players can get to sprint speed on average in about 10 to 12 meters. So if you're thinking about training for sprints, we're looking at distances, if we're standing start, from 0 to 30 meters. Okay, and then distances between that. So the majority of sprints happen under the 20 meters. Okay, so 14 of those happen under 20 meters, right? So if we're starting from a standing start, we might be running 20 meters, 20 meters or 25 up to 30 meters. But remember, the players are moving, okay? So that is one. Number two is, if they can get that in a game situation or a drill, brilliant. Because players need to decide when to run. Okay, when is to run, and more often than not, it's to do with the ball. Okay, it's something to do with the ball. The ball is about to come, or the opposition player is moving towards the ball, and they're reacting to that. So quite often in the case, if we do sprints in isolation, we're not getting that thinking and starting speed with our eyes, which is important. I'm going to contrast that now and say, if we're working on peak speed, quite often the case, if we use the ball all the time, a lot of the players, and maybe players with limited ability or miss a touch or lose control of the ball, their speed actually decreases. So they don't get an opportunity maybe to increase their speed. So if you know your team, obviously, right? And some of the sprints, on some of the occasions that you're doing sprints, you may have to do them without the ball to hit the peak speeds. Okay. And that was the thing about the small set of games, which is very, very popular. We're playing small set of games now, but quite often it's the case that the area is too small for sprinting. Now, in this small area, it is good because we're practicing acceleration and agility. So it depends on the component of fitness that you're emphasizing. I hope that kind of makes some sense.
Yeah, no, great. We had another question just around the presentation then, and the restart times. Were the restart times calculated from when the shot or the free was taken, or when the ball went dead from the shot or free?
Or across the crossbar, that was the time, rather than when it left the hurley before it went wide. The freeze, again, when the referee blew the whistle, and then from the restart, it was the contact on the hurley from the goalkeeper that restarted the clock. So there was over 3,000 ball in play and 3,000 ball out of play analysed. So there was a big pool of data to average out the data right across the games. Yeah.
Okay, great. With another one there, what would be the best type of exercises to get players prepared for these sprint patterns? I'm assuming that's probably in relation to the lads being maybe, or the ladies being in lockdown at the moment, and what activities they may do at home. But maybe Seamus can clarify that as well.
Yeah, okay. I'll start, and if Seamus wants to add something in or come in about that. We need to be really, really careful around this lockdown and getting the players, and we're all going into pre-season, be it at intercounty level or club level. We need to think about getting the players back up into high intensity. Okay, so if you can imagine going back out and doing sprints straight away, well, we're increasing their risk of injury. Okay, so if we kind of gradually climb them out to do 22 sprints in a match, and that's in championship, well, we can gradually work them back up into that capacity. Okay, so even in pre-season, the players need to be running quite quickly, but again, it's phased up. That the first couple of nights, the intensity wouldn't be anywhere near sprinting; it would be more high-speed running or that, and you build them back up to that. But a general rule would be 10%. If we can keep the progression to under 10%, well, they're less likely to get injured. Once we go over that 10%, well, we're risking. The risk is higher. Okay. Now, if we have loads of players doing 1 kilometer or 1 miles or 5 mile runs, well, when they come back into changing speed, well, they're at higher risk of injury. Instead of sending your players off now for 1Ks or 1 miles or 5 miles, send them off for that distance, but the intensity should change. So some on the call might remember the old concept of lamp post running. So between 2 lampposts, you change your intensity. So you might go jogging between the first 2, then increase in speed between the next 2, then decrease and increase and decrease. And it's better for the conditioning for hurlers or camogie players, that type of concept, rather than the volume of 1 miles or 5 mile runs.
Thank you. We 2 more then.
Yep.
We had, well, one was from Declan there. He's just asking if it would be possible to get a copy of the slides, the presentation. It's recorded anyway, I suppose, but I suppose that's just your own discretion, Damien.
Send them on.
And then the last one there was, if you have any data on the number of straight lines as opposed to multi-directional sprints?
Yeah, okay, so the technical scientific answer is no. What that would require is that the matches would be videoed and then quantified in terms of the changes of direction. What we do know from the GPS plots is that we can see the directions of movement on the map, right? And what we notice is that some are running away from the goals, some are running through the goals, some are longer, some are shorter, some involve change of direction, but very few are straight line. Very few. So in general terms, I would say that around 80%, 90% of them have some change of direction. And it's quite often, it's more of a curve rather than a hard cut. And what do I mean by a hard cut? A hard change of direction. So it might be a 45-degree or 60-degree angle, which is quite common in training, that you might go out and perform a severe change of direction, or even worse, a 180-degree turn. It's very, very rare that we see a 180-degree turn, so that they run out, turn, and run back in. And if you think about training, we do that really, really frequently. Okay, and it's just setting up the drills that we need to think about setting them up in a different way.
Thank you. Just one last question then was, what is the ratio of match meters versus training meters in terms to meet the requirements of the game?
Okay, so an interesting concept is that we need to replicate the match demands in training so that they're able for them to do it in a match. Okay, but if, for example, we have a game at the weekend, or we're getting ready for games, Well, it doesn't make sense that we actually have a full match played 2 or 3 times in that week. And if we don't even have a match right at the weekend, it doesn't make sense that we're performing a match load or the match volume every training session. So what we should be doing is picking elements of the match and repeating those. So if we know that they're able to do 22 sprints in a match, well, we might do those 22 sprints, but we mightn't be doing the 7,800 meters. So the overall volume might be low, but the higher intensity stuff might be hitting the match demands. And then the critical thing is, instead of the overall match volume, it's their ability to change speed. So acceleration, deceleration is critical. So if I could mention anything, a take-home message is to look at the intensity of your training activities. Quite often, it's the case that we run small set of games for a long period of time, maybe for 5 minutes or 10-minute games, where the intensity drops, and as they go on, the intensity drops lower and lower and lower and lower and lower, and then the players get used to that lower intensity, and will struggle when they get to the high intensity. And that's why I was emphasizing the mile runs or the 5-mile runs. The player comes off and starts fast, and then they level off for a period of time and distance, and then they decrease. Whereas in hurling, if you think back on the GPS plot, it's constantly up and down. It's changing speeds all the time.
Brilliant, Damien. Listen, thanks very much. There's no more questions there. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of everybody here at Antrim GA, and hopefully we'll get seeing you soon again.
Please God, and hopefully in person the next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks everybody else for logging on also, and I'll send out the information of the slides there as well. All right, thanks folks. All the best.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.